The ground beneath Mount St. Helens is sinking. Slowly, quietly, it has been settling downward for years. And on a single morning this July, while it was still sinking, it started to shake. Small earthquakes, far below the crater, in a mountain that most people assume has been asleep since 1980. Here is what makes that strange. Everything you have been taught says a volcano about to erupt should swell, should bulge, should rise. This one is doing the opposite. It is shrinking and trembling at the same time, sitting calmly on the lowest alert level there is, and yet something down in the dark is unmistakably moving. So which is it? Is Mount St. Helens quietly dying, or quietly reloading? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The morning the mountain moved. Somewhere beneath a mountain in the south of Washington state, on the morning of July 23, 2026, a set of thin lines that had been running almost perfectly flat began to jump. They belonged to seismographs, the instruments that listen to the ground the way a stethoscope listens to a chest. Most days, under this particular mountain, they draw something close to a straight line, hour after hour, a quiet so ordinary that nobody thinks to look at it. And then, a little after 8 in the morning, the quiet broke. The first event that the monitoring networks were able to formally measure came in at around magnitude 0.9 near 8:21 in the morning local time. A second one followed, roughly magnitude 0.8, a little after 9:27. If you're picturing something dramatic, adjust the picture. These are not earthquakes you would feel. You could be standing directly over them, holding a cup of coffee, and the surface of that coffee would not so much as tremble. On paper, they are almost nothing. 2 faint scratches on a roll of digital paper, in a place where the paper is usually blank. But this is not just any place. The mountain those instruments are wired to is Mount St. Helens, and when the seismographs under Mount St. Helens start scribbling, people who watch these things lean in a little closer, because this is the mountain that taught an entire country what a volcano can actually do. So 2 small earthquakes before breakfast are never really just 2 small earthquakes here. They are a question. The question is whether the mountain is only clearing its throat, or whether it is starting to say something. Here is the first strange thing, and it is the thing that pulls you into everything that follows. When independent observers went and looked at the raw seismic traces that morning, the unfiltered squiggles straight off the stations on and around the mountain, they did not see 2 events. They saw many more. Little bursts stacked through the hours, most of them too faint to be given an official magnitude, too small for the automatic systems to pin down to an exact spot. And that gap, the difference between the 2 earthquakes that got a number and the dozens of flickers that did not, is where the suspicion always begins. If the ground moved 40 times and the official count says 2, what happened to the other 38? We're going to come back to that gap because it matters and because the popular explanation for it is wrong in a way that is genuinely interesting. But hold it in your mind for now as the first loose thread. Something is happening under Mount St. Helens, more than the headline number suggests, and the mountain is not one you get to ignore. Now, the natural reaction, the one almost everyone has, is a simple chain of logic. A famous volcano is having earthquakes. Earthquakes mean pressure. Pressure means magma. Magma means it is coming up. And if it is coming up, then this is the beginning of the end of the long quiet, and we should all be watching the sky over Washington. That chain feels airtight. It feels like common sense. And on this particular mountain, it even has a precedent so vivid that it is burned into the national memory. Except the data from that same morning quietly breaks the chain in half. Because while the ground under Mount St. Helens was shaking, the ground on top of Mount St. Helens was not doing what the scary version requires. It was not swelling. It was not bulging outward or lifting up the way a balloon does when you blow into it. If anything, the surface of the volcano has been doing the opposite, and it has been doing it for years. The measurements of the mountain's shape show its elevation slowly, stubbornly settling, sinking, deflating. Sit with how odd that is for a second. We have a volcano that is shaking and sinking at the same time, trembling, and yet quietly collapsing inward rather than rising. The earthquakes say energy. The shape says the air is going out of the tire, not into it. Those 2 facts are not supposed to sit next to each other, and the entire mystery of this video lives in the space between them. What does it mean when a volcano shakes without swelling? I want to be clear and calm about where things actually stand, because that honesty is the whole point of this channel. As of the summer of 2026, Mount St. Helens sits at a volcano alert level of normal and an aviation colour code of green. That is the lowest setting there is. No scientific agency is forecasting an eruption. Nobody with a seismic network and a badge is telling people to leave. This is not a warning, and I am not going to pretend it is one to keep you watching. The truth is more interesting than a fake alarm. Because the truth is this: a volcano can be intensely, restlessly alive and still be years, even decades, away from erupting. Alive and dangerous are not the same word, and the shaking but sinking signature we are looking at is not a contradiction to be afraid of. It is a clue. It is the mountain telling us something specific about what it is doing far below, if you know how to read it, and most people have never been taught the alphabet. It helps to understand what those instruments are really hearing, because the ground is a noisy place. A seismograph on the flank of a volcano does not only pick up earthquakes, it picks up wind shaking the trees, rockfall clattering down the crater walls, ice cracking on the glacier that sits inside that crater, logging trucks on a distant road, a river in flood, even storm waves pounding a coastline dozens of miles away. All of it arrives as wiggles on the same line. So when a scientist looks at a trace and says an earthquake happened, they are not just seeing a bump, they are seeing a specific shape, arriving at several stations in a specific order, at speeds that match rock rather than air or water. That is the difference between a squiggle and a located earthquake, and it is going to matter enormously when we get to the accusation that the authorities are hiding most of what the mountain does. There is another thing worth settling early, because it reframes the whole mood of this story. For most of the last several decades, Mount St. Helens has not been a sleeping giant in any real sense. It has been a stirring one. It rebuilt part of itself in the 1980s. It rebuilt more of itself in the middle 2000s. In between, and ever since, it has muttered, twitched, and swarmed on a schedule that has almost nothing to do with an eruption, and almost everything to do with a system that never fully switches off. A little shaking under this mountain is not the exception. On the long view, it is closer to the rule, which means the interesting question is never simply is it moving. The mountain is almost always moving. The interesting question is what kind of moving, and in which direction, and how far below your feet. That is why the sinking surface is not a footnote. It is the centre of the mystery. Think of the difference between a tank that is quietly filling underground and a lid that is being pushed up from beneath. Both involve pressure. Both can rattle the rock. But one of them is refilling in the dark and going nowhere in a hurry, while the other is a countdown you can measure with a ruler. A shaking, sinking Mount St. Helens is pointing us toward one of those pictures and away from the other, and learning to tell them apart is the difference between panic and understanding. That is what we are going to do over the course of this. We are going to learn the alphabet. We are going to figure out why a volcano would shake while it shrinks, why the official earthquake count is smaller than the raw one without anybody hiding a thing, and why the version of Mount St. Helens that should actually frighten you looks nothing like the morning of July 23rd. By the end, that quiet green status is going to feel like the most reassuring sentence in the world, and also the most fragile. But to understand a shaking, sinking mountain, you cannot stay up here on the surface where the coffee sits perfectly still. You have to follow the tremors down, past the old lava, past the roots of the crater, into a system that begins its work miles below the bottom of the mountain, in the dark, where the real story of Mount St. Helens has always been written. So let us go down. Part 2. A volcano that shakes without swelling. Most of what we believe about volcanoes was installed in us long before we ever saw real data. It came from cartoons, from disaster films, from that one diagram in a school textbook with the bright red arrow pushing straight up through the middle of a cone. In that mental model, a volcano is a bottle of soda. Pressure builds, the surface strains, and eventually the whole thing blows its top in a single vertical burst. It is a clean, satisfying story. It is also, for a mountain like the one we are looking at, only half true, and the missing half is exactly where people go wrong. The intuition itself is not stupid. When magma genuinely does push toward the surface, it really does announce itself, and it announces itself in a very particular way. The molten rock forces the ground above it to stretch and lift, so the surface swells outward, sometimes by an amount you can measure with instruments, sometimes by an amount you could eventually see. and the earthquakes that come with that rising magma tend to march upward too, starting lower and getting shallower over days and weeks, like footsteps climbing a staircase toward the door. Rising magma inflates and shallows. That is the fingerprint of an actual ascent. Remember those two words, inflates and shallows, because they are the yardstick we are going to hold everything against. Now hold that yardstick up against the morning of July 23rd. The earthquakes are there, yes, but the inflation is not. The surface of Mount St. Helens is not swelling to meet the shaking, it is settling, and the quakes are not climbing a staircase toward the surface. They are sitting far below, staying put. Two of the three fingerprints that a real ascent would leave are simply missing. What we have instead is shaking without swelling, energy without lift, and that is the puzzle the whole story turns on. The reason this puzzle feels so loaded, the reason two tiny tremors can make a person's stomach drop, has a name, and the name is the history of this specific mountain. Mount St. Helens is the most active volcano in the Cascade Range, the long chain of peaks that runs down the Pacific Northwest. It is not the tallest, and it is not the widest, but it is the busiest, the one most likely to do something in any given human lifetime. And it is the one that, within living memory, did the single most catastrophic thing an American volcano has done in the modern era. So when its instruments flicker, they flicker against a backdrop that everyone over a certain age remembers personally. That memory is doing a lot of the emotional work here, and we will honour it fully later because it turns out to be the most useful teaching tool we have. But memory is not measurement, and this is where the calm, boring official reality matters. As of the summer of 2026, the scientists whose entire job is to watch this mountain have it set at a volcano alert level of normal with an aviation colour code of green. Those are the lowest readings on the scale. There is no watch, no warning, no advisory. No one is being told to pack a bag. If the professionals who stare at these seismographs for a living genuinely believed the mountain was loading up to erupt, the dials would not still be sitting on green. They are not panicking, and that fact alone should lower your own pulse a few beats. And yet, I do not want to swing you all the way to the other side and tell you it is nothing, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. Normal is not the same word as nothing. A green light does not mean the mountain is dead or empty or finished. It means that what it is doing right now falls inside the range of things it does when it is not erupting, which is a much stranger and more active range than most people imagine. This is the balance the entire channel tries to hold. We are not here to sell you an eruption that is not coming. We are also not here to wave the whole thing away, because the honest middle is where the actually interesting science lives. Something is moving under Mount St. Helens. It is just not the something you were trained to fear. It is worth pausing on how we even know the surface is not swelling, because this is not somebody's impression or a guess from a webcam. The shape of Mount St. Helens is watched with a precision that borders on the absurd. There are receivers bolted to the rock that track their own position using satellites overhead, and they can sense their location shifting by a matter of millimeters, less than the width of a pencil eraser, over months. There are tilt meters that measure whether the ground is leaning, the way a carpenter's level measures a shelf. There are radar satellites that pass over again and again and compare the images to see whether the land between them has risen or fallen by a fraction of an inch. Layer all of that together, and you get a continuous high-resolution portrait of whether the mountain is breathing in or breathing out, and that portrait for Mount St. Helens has been showing a slow exhale, not inflation, settling. The instruments that would light up first if magma was swelling. The shallow part of the mountain have not lit up. That absence is not a comfort I am inventing to calm you down. It is a measured, load-bearing fact, and it is doing more work in this story than any single earthquake. Because a volcano that shakes while its surface holds flat or sinks is telling you, in the most direct language it has, that whatever is moving is not moving up into the mountain. It is doing something else, lower down. Hold on to that, because it is the thread that runs through everything. So what is it? What do you call a mountain that shakes without swelling, that hums with small earthquakes while its surface quietly settles, that is unmistakably doing something and yet sits on green? There is a word for it, and it is one of those words that sounds almost gentle, almost administrative, right up until you understand what it describes. The scientists who watch this volcano use it constantly, in their bulletins and their papers, whenever the mountain behaves this exact way. Before I give you the word, I want to plant one more loose thread, because it is going to grow into one of the biggest misunderstandings in this entire subject. Remember that gap from a moment ago, the official count of 2 earthquakes against the raw count of dozens. A lot of people look at that gap and reach for the darkest possible explanation. They decide the low official number is a lie, that the true activity is being deliberately hidden, that the mountain is far busier than the public is allowed to know. It is an understandable suspicion, and it is completely wrong. And the reason it is wrong is genuinely more interesting than the conspiracy. We are going to take that accusation seriously and dismantle it properly, piece by piece, later on. For now, just notice how quickly a simple counting problem turns into a story about being lied to. That reflex is going to come back. Here, then, is the word. The thing Mount St. Helens is doing, the thing that makes it shake while it sinks, the thing that keeps it green while it stirs, is called recharge. It is a quiet word for a process that is anything but finished. And to understand why a recharging volcano behaves exactly backward from what your instincts predict, why it can tremble and shrink at the same time and still be nowhere near an eruption, we have to leave the surface entirely. We have to go down past the crater floor, past the old plug of hardened lava, into a plumbing system that starts its work about 16 miles below the mountain, in the dark, where the pressure never really lets go. Part 3. What recharge really means. Recharge is one of those technical words that hides a picture inside it, and once you see the picture, the whole mountain makes sense. Picture a tank buried far underground that very slowly fills from below, not a dramatic gush, a trickle, over months and years, of molten rock rising from lower down and collecting in a chamber, pressing outward on the walls of that chamber as it accumulates. That is recharge. It is a volcano being resupplied, and the key thing to understand, the thing that unlocks everything, is that filling the tank and firing the tank are 2 completely different events, separated sometimes by decades. To really follow it, we have to trace the plumbing from the bottom up because Mount St. Helens is not a simple hollow cone with a pool of lava under the summit. It is the top of a tall, thin system that reaches far below the mountain you can see. Down near the base of the crust, roughly 16 miles beneath the surface, is where the magma is born. That is the source region, where heat and pressure squeeze molten rock out of the lower crust. From there, it does not rush upward. It rises slowly, buoyantly, the way something lighter works its way up through something heavier, threading through the rock over long stretches of time. And I do mean long. This is not a process measured in hours or days, the way a news alert wants everything to be. The rise and pooling of magma through a system like this plays out over years, sometimes decades. The mountain is patient on a timescale that has almost nothing in common with a human attention span, and that patience is itself part of why recharge is not an emergency. Something can be genuinely, continuously happening under your feet, and still be nowhere near a conclusion, in the same way that a glacier is always moving and never in a hurry. The volcano keeps its own clock, and its clock runs slow. It also helps to correct the cartoon in your head about what that reservoir actually is. When people hear magma chamber, they imagine a smooth cavern brimming with glowing orange liquid, like a swimming pool waiting to overflow. The reality is less cinematic and far more important to understand. The reservoir is mostly solid rock with molten rock threaded through it, a hot, stiff mush, closer to a rock-hard sponge soaked with melt than to an open pool. That structure matters enormously, because a mush does not transmit pressure instantly to the surface the way an open pool of liquid would. It absorbs, it buffers. New magma can push into it, a new pressure can build, and the mush can soak up a great deal of that change without immediately shoving the crater floor upward. This is one more reason a recharging volcano can shake far below while its surface barely reacts, and it is one more reason the shaking without swelling signature points toward filling rather than firing. As it rises, it collects. Somewhere in the range of 2.5 to 6 miles below sea level, the magma pools into a reservoir, a holding chamber partway up the system. This is the tank. It is not a cartoon cavern full of glowing liquid. It is more like hot, partly molten rock mixed through solid rock, a zone that can store magma and pressure and release both on its own schedule. And when fresh magma pushes up from the source region far below and adds itself to that reservoir, the reservoir responds the only way a pressurized container can. It strains against everything around it. That straining is where the earthquakes come from, and the mechanism is worth walking through slowly, because it explains the entire strange signature we started with. When new magma arrives in the reservoir, it raises the pressure inside. That pressure presses on the surrounding rock and squeezes fluids, hot water and dissolved gas, out into the cracks and fractures that lace the crust around the chamber. Those fluids force their way through the cracks, and as they do, they change the friction on tiny faults that were sitting locked and quiet. A fault that was stuck slips. Just a hair, just a few millimeters. That slip is an earthquake, a very small one, and then another crack and another slip and another, scattered through the rock around the filling tank. Now you can see why these particular earthquakes look the way they do. They are small because nothing large is breaking. No huge slab of the mountain is failing. It is the plumbing flexing under pressure, and pressure plumbing produces little pops, not violent ruptures. And they sit far below the surface, clustered around the reservoir a couple of miles down, because that is where the action is. They are not climbing toward the crater. They have no reason to. The magma is not marching up the staircase toward the door. It is settling into the tank and pushing on the walls. This is the revelation that reframes the whole morning of July 23rd, so let me say it as plainly as I can. The earthquakes under Mount St. Helens are most likely the sound of the tank filling, not the sound of the lid lifting. They are the noise a resupplying system makes, and a resupplying system is not the same as an erupting one, any more than a gas station filling its underground tanks is the same as a gas station on fire. The shaking is real. The energy is real. But it is the signature of a volcano being fed, not a volcano about to let go. There is one more piece of the plumbing worth naming now because it becomes important later, and that is gas. Magma is not only molten rock, it carries dissolved gases inside it, carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds and water, held under pressure the way carbonation is held inside a sealed can. When a system is merely recharging far below, most of that gas stays locked in the reservoir, trapped by the pressure and the miles of rock overhead. It is not venting freely at the surface, and that too is something scientists measure, flying over the crater and sampling the air for the telltale gases a rising body of magma would release. A quiet recharge keeps its breath held. A volcano truly climbing toward an eruption starts to exhale, and you can find it in the data long before you can see it with your eyes. For now, hold gas as one more instrument on the panel, one more needle sitting calmly where 1980 would have pinned it hard. And here, finally, is where the sinking surface stops being a paradox and starts being a confirmation. If the earthquakes were caused by magma shoving its way up toward the crater, the ground above would have to bulge to make room for it. That is not optional. You cannot push a body of magma into the shallow part of a mountain without the surface swelling to accommodate it. So the fact that the surface is not swelling, the fact that it is actually settling, is a giant clue that the magma is not doing that. The activity is staying low, staying in the tank exactly where recharge lives. The deflation is not the tank draining. We are going to see later, in careful detail, that it is the shallow part of the mountain quietly cooling and compacting, above a system that is charging far beneath it. Two different depths, doing two different things, at the same time. I want to let that settle because it inverts the fear completely. The very feature that made this look scary at first glance, a shaking mountain whose surface is going down, is actually one of the more reassuring combinations you can see. Shaking plus sinking is the calling card of recharge. Shaking plus rising would be the one to make you sit up. And Mount St. Helens, on the morning we are examining, was doing the first thing, not the second. But I promised you honesty, and honesty cuts both ways here, so I'm not going to leave you with a tidy bow. Because if this quiet, low, no-lift shaking is what normal recharge looks like, then a real reawakening, the genuine article, must look different. It has to. And that raises the single most important question in this entire subject, the one that separates people who understand volcanoes from people who merely fear them. If refilling and reawakening both start with earthquakes under the same mountain, how on earth do you tell them apart before it is too late? What is actually different between the tank filling and the lid lifting in the signals we can measure in time to matter? That question does not have a theoretical answer. It has a historical one. Because Mount St. Helens has done both. It has spent decades quietly recharging, filling its tank, shaking and sinking and going nowhere. And exactly one time in the modern record it did the other thing. It reawakened. It inflated and shallowed and climbed the staircase, and threw the door off its hinges in front of the entire world. If we want to know what a real countdown looks like, so we can be certain that today is not one, we do not have to guess. We can go back and watch the countdown that actually happened, minute by minute, and learn its fingerprints until we could never mistake them. So that is where we're going next. Back to the last time this mountain stopped merely filling and started firing. Back to the spring of 1980. Part 4. The silence breaks. For 123 years, Mount St. Helens did almost nothing. Before the spring of 1980, the last time it had shown any serious life was back in the 1850s. Generations were born and died in the Pacific Northwest, with the mountain as nothing more than a beautiful symmetrical cone on the horizon, a postcard, a picnic backdrop, the kind of peak people called perfect because of how cleanly it rose. If you had told the people living in its shadow that it was a loaded weapon, most of them would have laughed. It looked asleep. It had looked asleep their entire lives, and that long, convincing sleep is exactly why what happened next is the most valuable teaching tape we have. Because in the middle of March, 1980, the mountain woke up, and it did not do it quietly, and it did not do it in the pattern we have been watching this summer. It did the opposite pattern, and the difference between those two patterns is the whole reason we are taking this trip back in time. I am not telling you the story of 1980 to frighten you about today. I am telling it to you so that you can hold the two side by side and see, with your own eyes, how little they resemble each other. It started with earthquakes, which might sound familiar, but pay attention to how these earthquakes behaved, because behavior is everything. In mid-March of 1980, a swarm of quakes began under the mountain, and within a week they were coming by the hundreds. They were not the tiny, far-below murmurs we have been describing. They were larger, many of them big enough to feel, and crucially they were shallow and getting shallower. They clustered up near the surface and climbed. Remember the yardstick, the two words inflates and shallows. This was the shallows half, unfolding in real time. The staircase was being climbed step by step toward the door. Then, on March 27th, 1980, the mountain took the next step, and it was a step today's mountain has not taken at all. A blast of steam tore a crater straight through the ice and snow at the summit. This was a phreatic explosion, which is a specific and important thing. Phreatic means it was driven by water flashing to steam, not by fresh magma erupting, groundwater hitting hot rock and detonating like a pressure cooker with the lid clamped down. It threw ash across the white snowfields and turned the postcard cone grey, and it announced, unmistakably, that heat was reaching the shallow parts of the mountain, close enough to the surface to boil the water hiding there. Now compare that to the summer of 2026. There has been no phreatic blast, no crater torn in the ice, no column of steam and ash. The heat is not reaching up to boil the shallow water, because the action, as we have seen, is sitting far below in the reservoir, not climbing toward the crater. One of 1980's opening moves is simply absent from today's board. That absence is not luck. It is a signature. There was another signature in 1980 that is worth naming, because it is one of the eeriest sounds a volcano makes. Alongside the discrete pops of individual earthquakes, the instruments began to pick up harmonic tremor. Ordinary earthquakes are sharp and separate, a jolt, and then quiet, like someone knocking on a door. Harmonic tremor is different. It is a continuous rhythmic hum that can go on for minutes or hours, and it is generally read as the sound of fluid, magma or gas moving through the system, vibrating the rock as it flows. When the discrete knocks give way to a sustained hum, scientists take notice, because it often means something is on the move. 1980 had that hum. The morning of July 23rd did not. It had knocks, small and scattered and far below, and then quiet. Do you see the picture assembling itself? In 1980, the earthquakes were shallow and climbing. Today they are far below and staying put. In 1980, steam blasts tore open the summit. Today the summit is untouched. In 1980, harmonic tremor hummed through the rock as fluid climbed. Today there are only scattered pops. Every single one of 1980's early warning signs pointed upward and outward, toward the surface, toward release. Today's signs point down and in, toward the tank, toward filling. These are not the same mountain in two different moods. They are two fundamentally different processes wearing the same word, earthquakes, on the outside. It is worth remembering what those 2 months were actually like on the ground, because the length and the visibility of that countdown are the whole point. This was not a private conversation between a mountain and a few instruments. It was a public event that unfolded slowly enough for an entire region to watch it happen. Authorities drew hazard zones around the mountain and set up roadblocks. People were moved out of the danger area. Geologists hiked and flew in to measure the growing bulge directly, bouncing laser beams off reflectors planted on the flank to clock exactly how far the rock had shifted since the day before. Newspapers ran the story for weeks. The mountain gave notice, loud and sustained notice, and it gave that notice for 2 full months before the end came. Some people even had time to refuse the warning. The most famous was an old lodge owner who lived by a lake at the foot of the mountain and told reporters, again and again, that he would not leave, that the mountain would not dare touch him. He became a folk figure that sprang precisely because everyone knew a reckoning was coming and could watch it building. That is what a real countdown affords. The terrible luxury of time, of watching, of arguing about whether to go. Now set all of that against the morning of July 23rd, 2026. There was no 2-month escalation. There were no roadblocks, no hazard zones, no crews racing to remeasure a swelling flank. There was a handful of small tremors far below the surface, and then quiet, and a mountain sitting on green. The 1980 countdown was a slow, visible, public thing. Today is not a countdown at all, and its silence on every one of those fronts is the loudest evidence we have. And this is the part I most want to stick with you as we go further into the 1980 story, because it is easy to get swept up in the drama of what happened and forget why we came. We came to build a template. We came to learn, precisely and unforgettably, what a real countdown looks like, so that when we return to the present we can check today's mountain against it, box by box. So far, 1980 has already failed to match today on 3 separate signals, and we have not even reached the part everyone remembers. Keep counting the differences. Because in the spring of 1980, the shallow earthquakes and the steam and the hum were only the overture. The mountain was about to do something visible from the road, something you did not need an instrument to see, something that swelled out of its northern flank a little more every single day, and that, the thing you could watch grow, is the clearest warning this mountain has ever given, and the one whose absence today matters most of all. Part 5. The Bulge. Imagine standing at a safe distance in April of 1980, looking at the north face of the mountain and realizing that it is a different shape than it was last week. Not because of shadows or snow, because the rock itself is moving. The entire northern flank of Mount St. Helens had begun to swell outward, to push toward you, and it was doing it fast enough that instruments could clock the growth from one day to the next. This is the moment the 1980 story stops being about squiggles on a page and becomes something a human eye can follow, and it is the single most important contrast in this entire video. The number that scientists measured is the kind of number that makes you read it twice. The bulge on the north flank was growing outward at a rate of roughly 5 feet per day. 5 feet, every day. A section of a mountain, moving sideways and outward the length of a tall man's height in the span of a single day, and then doing it again the next day, and the next. Over the weeks that this went on, the flank pushed out on the order of 450 feet from where it had been. Picture a swelling the size of a small hill emerging from the side of the mountain, visibly, measurably, relentlessly, and you begin to understand the dread of the people watching it. What was actually happening under that bulge is the thing that ties it straight back to our story. Magma was no longer content to sit far below in the reservoir and quietly recharge. It had begun forcing its way up into the shallow body of the mountain, intruding into the north flank, and because it had nowhere else to go, it shoved the whole face outward ahead of it. Scientists call a body of magma like that, lodged shallow inside a volcano, a cryptodome, a hidden dome, and the flank of the mountain was being inflated over it like skin stretching over a blister that will not stop filling. This was magma on the move, in the shallow part of the system, announcing itself in the most physical way imaginable. Now hold that against the yardstick one more time, because here is the other half of it, the half we have been waiting for, inflates and shallows. 1980 had the shallow earthquakes, and now, with the bulge, it had the inflation, spectacularly, undeniably, 5 feet a day of it. The surface was not settling. The surface was heaving outward. Both halves of the fingerprint of a genuine ascent were present and screaming. The staircase had been climbed and the door itself was beginning to bend. To grasp 450 feet of bulge, picture a football field and a half of solid rock pushed sideways out of a mountainside standing where nothing had been before. That is not a subtle deformation you need instruments to detect. Toward the end, it was a visible disfigurement of the mountain's profile, a swelling that changed the shape of the peak against the sky, and it was growing by roughly 5 feet every single day, which meant that from 1 week to the next, the bulge advanced the length of a small room. There has never been a clearer or more physical warning from this mountain, a piece of it visibly inflating toward the people watching it. And it is exactly that kind of gross, unmistakable, accelerating swelling that the modern instruments would catch in its earliest and smallest stages today, long before it reached anything like that scale. Today those same instruments are watching the mountain move the other way entirely, and that, precisely that, is what today's mountain is not doing. This is why I keep returning to the boring instruments that watch the shape of the peak, the receivers that measure their position by satellite, the radar that compares the land from orbit. In the summer of 2026, those instruments show the surface of Mount St. Helens going down, not up. There is no bulge, there is no flank pushing outward at 5 feet a day, or at 5 inches a day, or at any rate at all. There is the opposite, a slow settling. So when I told you earlier that a sinking surface is reassuring, this is the memory I wanted you to have in hand. Deflation is reassuring precisely because inflation is what preceded the worst day in this mountain's modern history. We have seen what the surface does when magma is truly climbing into the shallow mountain. It swells. Today it is doing the reverse. There is a human dimension to the bulge that matters too, and it is a warning against overconfidence in the other direction. The scientists watching that swelling in 1980 could measure it, but they could not tell you the exact hour it would fail. They knew it could not go on forever. They knew a flank cannot keep pushing outward at 5 feet a day indefinitely without something giving way. But the precise trigger, the exact moment, stayed hidden from them right up until it happened. That humility is worth carrying forward. Reading a volcano is not the same as having its schedule. Even a warning as loud as a 450-foot bulge did not come with a timestamp. There was something particularly ominous about the direction of the bulge, and it is worth understanding because it shaped everything that came after. The mountain was not swelling straight up at the summit, which is where you might expect a volcano to strain. It was swelling out its side to the north, low on the flank. That meant the shallow magma was lodged off-center, pushing horizontally against a slope, loading it like a drawn bow. A summit that rises can vent upward. A flank that bulges sideways can fail, can slide, and a slide changes everything about how a volcano releases its energy. The people watching in 1980 understood this. They understood that a 450-foot swelling on a steep northern slope was not merely growth, it was a landslide being slowly assembled in plain sight at 5 feet a day. This is the last time I will hold the two mountains directly side by side before we move on, because by now the contrast should feel almost physical. In 1980, the shallow earthquakes, the steam, the tremor and the bulge all arrived together and pointed the same way, upward and outward, converging on a single conclusion. Today those signals do not converge because most of them are not there at all. The one measurement that would match 1980 most directly, a swelling surface, is not merely missing today, it is reversed. The ground is going down. When people look at a shaking mountain and feel their stomach drop, it is 1980 they are remembering whether they know it or not. And the single most useful thing you can carry out of that memory is this. The flank that killed 57 people announced itself by growing. The mountain today is shrinking. So we arrive at the edge of the thing everyone remembers, armed now with the template we came for. We have watched 1980 assemble the full set of warnings, one after another. Shallow earthquakes climbing toward the surface, steam blasts tearing open the summit, harmonic tremor humming through the rock, and a whole flank of the mountain swelling outward 5 feet a day over a cryptodome of shallow magma. 4 signals, all pointing up and out, all absent from the mountain we are watching this summer. That is the countdown. And on a clear spring morning, at 32 minutes past 8, with a single sharp jolt, that countdown reached 0, and the north face of Mount St. Helens stopped bulging and started to move all at once. Part 6, 8:32 in the morning. 32 minutes past 8 in the morning, May 18th, 1980. That is the timestamp on the moment everything the mountain had been building toward for 2 months came due in a matter of seconds. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath Mount St. Helens. On its own, a magnitude 5.1 is a moderate quake, the kind that rattles dishes. But this one hit a mountain whose entire north face was already stretched to its limit over a growing body of shallow magma, and it knocked out the last support holding that face in place. What happened next was the largest landslide in recorded history. The whole bulging north flank of the mountain, billions of tons of rock came loose at once and slid away. An entire side of a mountain in motion, roaring downhill at well over 100 miles an hour, filling valleys, burying a river, swallowing everything in its path. Nothing on this scale had ever been documented before, and in sliding away, that flank did something with consequences far worse than the landslide itself. It uncorked the mountain. Think back to the cryptodome, the shallow magma that had been inflating the flank. It had been held down, pressurized, capped by the weight of the mountainside on top of it. When that mountainside suddenly slid off, the pressure released instantly, the way it does when you shear the cap off a shaken bottle, rather than unscrewing it slowly. Except the release did not go straight up. With the north flank gone, the pressure blew sideways, out of the fresh wound in the mountain's side. This is what is meant by the lateral blast, and it is the detail that made 1980 so lethal. The explosion travelled outward, low and fast across the ground, not politely upward into the sky. The numbers of that blast are difficult to hold in your head. It flattened forests across roughly 230 square miles. Full-grown trees, entire hillsides of them, snapped and laid down in neat rows pointing away from the mountain like matchsticks combed by a giant hand. The mountain itself lost around 1,300 feet of its height in the event, about 400 meters, its summit dropping from roughly 9,677 feet to about 8,363. The classic symmetrical cone that had been a postcard for generations was simply gone, replaced by a gaping horseshoe crater open to the north. Ash climbed into the sky and drifted east, reaching Idaho by around noon. In the language scientists use to rank these things, it was a volcanic explosivity index of 5, a genuinely major eruption. And then there is the number that is not really a number at all. 57 people died that morning. Among them was a young United States Geological Survey scientist named David A. Johnston, who was stationed at an observation post called Coldwater, about 6 miles from the summit, which everyone had believed was a safe distance. It was not. When the lateral blast came, it was Johnston who got the warning out, in a radio call that has echoed through volcanology ever since. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. Those were among his last words. He was killed moments later, and his body was never found. The observatory that watches these Cascade volcanoes today carries his name, the David A. Johnston Cascades Volcano Observatory, and the people staring at the seismographs under Mount St. Helens this summer work in a building named for a man the mountain killed for standing too close. The years that followed turned the ruined mountain into something unexpected, an open-air laboratory. Scientists poured in to study a volcano caught in the act, to map the collapse, to trace the path of the blast, to watch how life slowly crept back into the grey waste around it. Much of what we now understand about how these mountains fail, about lateral blasts and flank collapses and the warning signs that precede them, was learned or sharpened in the aftermath of that single morning. The mountain that killed 57 people also taught the science that now protects people living around volcanoes like it all over the world. That is the quiet thread connecting 1980 to the seismograph readings of this summer. The reason we can look at a swarm of tiny earthquakes today and speak with any confidence about what they mean is that this mountain, more than almost any other on Earth, has been studied from the moment of catastrophe forward. Every lesson written in blood and ash in 1980 is a lesson now built into the instruments and into the people, watching the mountain shake and sink in 2026. The template is authoritative precisely because it costs so much to learn. I tell you all of this not to leave you shaken, but because the horror of 1980 is precisely what gives the template its authority. That was a real countdown. It ran for 2 months, and every phase of it was visible in advance to anyone reading the instruments. The earthquakes were shallow and climbing. The steam blast tore the summit open. The harmonic tremor hummed. The flank swelled outward 5 feet a day into a 450-foot bulge. And when it finally failed, it failed at a shallow depth, right where all the warnings had been pointing in the top of the mountain not miles below it. Everything about 1980 was an upward, outward, accelerating march toward the surface. The blast was not even the end of that morning's destruction. The heat melted snow and ice on the mountain almost instantly, and the meltwater mixed with loose rock and ash to form lahars, torrents of volcanic mud with the consistency of wet concrete that poured down the river valleys. They tore down the Toutle River, ripping out bridges and homes, and carried so much sediment into the larger rivers below that they choked the shipping channel of the Columbia River and left ocean vessels stranded. The lake at the mountain's foot was buried and remade in minutes. Ash fell like grey snow on towns across the region, turning midday to an eerie darkness in places, clogging car engines, caving in roofs, coating hundreds of miles of the northwest and drifting in ever thinner amounts clear across the country. Out of that catastrophe came the thing that most directly protects people today, and it ties this whole memory back to the present. The eruption made brutally clear how little was actually understood about these mountains, and it drove the creation of a permanent, serious effort to watch them, the observatory now named for the scientist who died that morning. The seismographs, the satellite measurements, the gas sampling flights, the entire apparatus we have been leaning on to interpret the summer of 2026 exists in the form it does because of what 1980 taught, at a cost of 57 lives. So when that apparatus tells us today that the mountain is shaking far below while its surface quietly settles, that reading is not casual and it is not guesswork. It comes from the most closely watched volcano in the country, monitored by an institution born out of the last time it truly let go. That is the authority behind the reassurance, and it is exactly why the contrast we are about to draw carries the weight that it does. Now carry that template back across 46 years and lay it over the mountain as it sits today, and feel how completely they refuse to match. Today's earthquakes are not shallow and climbing, they are far below and holding. There has been no steam blast, no torn summit, no sustained hum of moving fluid, and above all no bulge, no swelling, no flank pushing outward. The surface is going down, not up. Every needle that pinned to the red in 1980 is sitting calmly in the green today. The countdown template exists, we have it memorized now, and the present does not fit a single line of it. Which returns us at last to the real question, the one that the drama of 1980 was only ever meant to sharpen. If today is so clearly not a countdown, then what exactly is it? And how does a system this far below the surface reach up and shake the ground at all? To answer that, we have to follow the plumbing past the mountain entirely, out to the edge of the continent, to the machine that builds and refills Mount St. Helens in the first place. Part 7. The Conveyor Belt. Step back from the mountain for a moment and ask a question almost nobody asks, because the answer is the engine behind everything we have discussed. Why is there a volcano here at all? Mountains do not simply decide to fill with magma. Something has to make the molten rock, and keep making it, and keep pushing it up toward the surface, year after year, for the recharge we have been describing to even be possible. And the something that does that for Mount St. Helens is not under the mountain. It is offshore, out under the cold water of the Pacific, along one of the most consequential boundaries on the planet. That boundary is the Cascadia subduction zone. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a slab of the sea floor called the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced underneath the edge of North America. The ocean plate is denser, so where the two meet, the ocean plate loses, bending down and diving beneath the continent, sliding slowly into the hot interior of the Earth at an angle, mile after mile over millions of years. This is subduction, and it is the same machinery responsible for the region's largest earthquake hazard. But subduction does something else besides store up earthquakes, something that turns a plate boundary into a chain of volcanoes. Here is the mechanism, and it is one of the more elegant tricks in all of geology. The ocean plate that is diving down carries water with it, water locked into the seafloor rocks and sediments. As that slab sinks and heats up, the water is cooked out of it, driven upward into the wedge of hot mantle rock sitting above the descending plate. Now, you might think adding water to already scorching rock would do nothing, but water does something counterintuitive. It lowers the temperature at which rock melts. The mantle up there is hot enough to be on the edge of melting, but not quite there, and the arrival of water from the sinking slab tips it over the edge. The rock begins to melt. Magma is born, not from extra heat, but from the water wrung out of a drowning plate. That newborn magma is lighter than the solid rock around it, so it begins to rise, and where it collects and works its way toward the surface, you get a volcano. Line up all the places along the Pacific Northwest where this is happening, and you get the Cascade Arc, the great row of volcanoes standing back from the coast, parallel to that hidden boundary offshore. Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount Hood, and further south Mount Shasta and the rest. They are not a random scattering of peaks. They are the surface expression of a single process, the smokestacks of one enormous slow machine. And among all of them, Mount St. Helens is the most active, the youngest and most restless of the row, the one that erupts most often and most recently. This is the piece that connects the offshore machine directly to the shaking we started with. When we talk about magma recharging the reservoir beneath Mount St. Helens, this is where that magma ultimately comes from. The water squeezed out of the sinking Juan de Fuca plate, the melting it triggers far below, the slow rise of that melt into the plumbing under the mountain. The recharge is not a fluke or a random stirring. It is the near-surface end of a conveyor belt that runs from the ocean floor down into the mantle and back up under Washington State. The mountain shakes because the machine never stops feeding it, and the machine has been making itself heard lately, which is why this connects to things we have looked at recently. A little over a week ago, we spent time on the rising tremor counts along the Cascadia subduction zone, the faint far below signals that mark the plate boundary slowly slipping and adjusting far offshore. That was the same machine, watched from its seaward end down where the plates grind. What we are looking at now, the recharge under Mount St. Helens, is that same machine watched from its landward end, up where the magma it produces finally reaches a mountain. Two ends of one system. The tremor offshore and the recharge under the volcano are not separate mysteries. They are the same conveyor belt seen from opposite sides. It is hard to overstate how slow and how steady all of this is. The Juan de Fuca plate creeps beneath North America at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, a few centimeters a year, and it has been doing so for millions of years. The Cascade arc it feeds has been erupting on and off for well over 500,000 years. On that clock, the entire recorded history of human beings watching this mountain is a single blink. What that means for us is important. The magma factory offshore does not switch on and off with the news cycle. It runs continuously, producing melt at a slow, patient rate, delivering it upward over spans of time that dwarf a human life. A conveyor belt moving that slowly does not suddenly lurch into an eruption because it had a busy morning on the seismographs. It also helps to know why Mount St. Helens, of all the peaks in that row, is the one we watch most closely. It is the youngest and most active volcano in the Cascade Arc, and the magma it tends to produce is stickier and more charged with gas than the runnier lavas of some of its neighbours. Stickier, gassier magma is exactly the kind that, when it finally does erupt, tends to do so explosively rather than gently, which is precisely what the world saw in 1980. So Mount St. Helens sits in a peculiar position. It is the most likely of the Cascade volcanoes to do something in a given lifetime, and also the most likely to do that something violently. That combination is why a couple of small tremors under this particular mountain draw attention, that identical tremors under a quieter peak never would. It is not that St. Helens is misbehaving, it is that St. Helens is the star pupil of a very slow, very patient school. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear all this and conclude that a busy plate boundary means an imminent eruption, and that is not what any of this says. The conveyor belt runs constantly, on a timescale of millions of years, feeding the arc slowly and steadily. Its normal operation is exactly what produces quiet recharge, the tank filling far below, decade after decade, without an eruption. A working subduction zone is not an alarm. It is the reason the mountain exists at all, and the reason it will keep stirring for as long as the plate keeps sinking. So the fact that the machine is running, and even the fact that we can hear it in the tremor offshore, does not move today's mountain 1 inch closer to erupting. It simply explains why there is anything to recharge in the first place. But it does raise a sharper, more useful question, one that gets us closer to reading today's signals correctly. If the magma is made far below, at the top of a sinking plate, and pools in a reservoir a few miles down, then the earthquakes it produces should carry a fingerprint that tells us how far up the system the action has climbed. Depth, it turns out, is not just a number attached to an earthquake. Depth is a diagnosis. And the depths of the earthquakes under Mount St. Helens this summer are quietly telling us which part of the machine is active and which part is still sleeping. Part 8. Why the quakes live miles down. Every earthquake comes with a location, and that location has 3 parts. 2 of them are the ones people always quote, the latitude and longitude, the spot on the map. The third is the one that actually matters most for reading a volcano, and it is the one that gets left out of the headlines. It is how far below the surface the earthquake happened. Because when it comes to a restless mountain, where a quake sits vertically tells you far more than where it sits on a map. A tremor 2 miles down and a tremor a quarter mile down can look identical in magnitude and mean completely opposite things. Think of the system under Mount St. Helens as having levels, like floors of a building, and each floor produces a different kind of earthquake with a different meaning. Far down, around the reservoir a few miles below sea level, the earthquakes are small, clustered, and tied to pressure, the little pops of a filling tank straining the rock around it. That is the recharge floor. Higher up, in the shallow body of the mountain near the crater, earthquakes mean something more urgent, because that is where magma would be if it were actually climbing toward an eruption. Shallow quakes that grow in number and creep upward are the signature of ascent. And the difference between a swarm on the lower floor and a swarm on the upper floor is, quite literally, the difference between a mountain that is filling and a mountain that is firing. So where were the earthquakes on July 23rd? They were down at the lower levels, clustered around the reservoir, not up near the crater floor. They were on the recharge floor, not the ascent floor. This is the quiet, technical core of why the scientists have the mountain on green. It is not that they are ignoring the swarm, it is that they can read its depth, and its depth places it exactly where filling happens and nowhere near where erupting begins. The location on the map made news because the map says Mount St. Helens. The location in depth is what the professionals actually read, and it says, calmly, recharge. Contrast that, one more time, with the mountain's worst day. The earthquakes that mattered in the spring of 1980 were shallow. The magnitude 5.1 that triggered the collapse struck right up in the mountain, at the level of the bulge, where the shallow magma had intruded. That was an upper floor event in every sense, energy released right where the disaster was staged. Today's tremors are not upper floor events, they are basement events far below, where the building meets its foundation. Same mountain, different floor, and the floor is the whole story. There is a wider family of these low, quiet signals worth mentioning, because it ties back to that offshore machine. Along the Cascadia subduction zone, scientists routinely detect a kind of slow, faint shuddering far below, called tremor, produced as the plate boundary slips gently rather than snapping. It is low, it is weak, and crucially, it is not an alarm. It is the sound of the machine running in its normal gear, releasing strain a little at a time. The low earthquakes under the volcano belong to the same broad family of quiet, far below signals, the background hum of an active plate boundary and the volcanoes it feeds. When you learn to recognize that family, a lot of things that sound frightening on the surface resolve into the ordinary noise of a working system. There is even a special class of these low signals that comes from the very bottom of the system, and it is worth a mention because it shows how far down the monitoring reaches. Scientists sometimes record what are called long-period earthquakes, faint low-frequency events that originate far beneath a volcano, near the roots of its plumbing, and are generally thought to reflect magma or fluids shifting at those great depths. They are not a sign of an imminent eruption. If anything, they are another marker of a system being fed from below, the machinery of recharge operating at the base of the mountain. The fact that instruments can detect events that small, that far down, tells you something about how thoroughly this mountain is watched. Almost nothing happens under Mount St. Helens, at any level, without leaving a trace on somebody's seismograph. That completeness matters for how we read today. When you can hear the system from its roots near the base of the crust, all the way up to the shallow crater, you are not guessing about where the action is, you can place it. And on the morning of July 23rd, the action was low, down around the reservoir, exactly where a system quietly digesting new magma would produce it, and nowhere near the shallow levels where an eruption is staged. It is worth drawing one sharp distinction here, using something we looked at just a few days ago. Recently we covered a magnitude 5.6 earthquake off Vancouver Island, at the northern end of the Cascadia system. That was a genuinely sizable jolt, and it grabbed attention, but notice how different it was from what we are discussing now. That was a sudden break in the crust out near the plate boundary, a real earthquake in the classic sense, shallow and sharp and offshore. What is happening under Mount St. Helens is the opposite in almost every way, small instead of large, far below instead of shallow, a slow pressure murmur instead of a sudden snap. They are both expressions of the same plate machine, but they sit at different ends of it, and they mean different things. One is the boundary itself lurching. The other is a mountain quietly digesting the magma that boundary produces. It is worth knowing how scientists even figure out the depth of a tremor this small, because the method loops straight back to that earlier accusation about hidden earthquakes. A single station cannot tell you where an earthquake happened. It can only tell you that something arrived. To pin down a location, and especially a depth, you need the same signal recorded at several stations arranged around the mountain, and then you compare the tiny differences in when the waves reached each one. From those differences, you triangulate a point in 3 dimensions, including how far below the surface it sat. This is exactly why the smallest events never get a formal location. It is not that they are being hidden. It is that they registered clearly on only one instrument or two, which is simply not enough geometry to solve for a point. The physics of locating a quake requires a chorus. A whisper heard by a single microphone stays a whisper. There is also a clue hidden in the shape of the waves themselves, not just their timing. Ordinary earthquakes, the brittle snap of rock slipping against rock, produce a sharp, crisp jolt on the instruments. But volcanoes sometimes produce a different kind of event, longer and smoother. A low, drawn-out signal that scientists associate with fluid or gas moving through cracks rather than rock breaking. The character of the waveform, sharp versus smooth, is another line on the diagnosis, and the events under Mount St. Helens this summer have looked like ordinary brittle pops, the rock around the reservoir adjusting to pressure, not the smooth, fluid-driven signals that would suggest magma or gas surging upward through the shallow system. One more needle sitting exactly where recharge sits. I keep coming back to the same word because the data keeps pointing at it. Depth is the tell. The single most reassuring fact about the summer of 2026 is not that the earthquakes are few, or that they are small, though they are both. It is that they are low, sitting down at the recharge floor, far from the level where an eruption would have to begin. A shallow swarm climbing toward the crater would keep the scientists up at night. A low swarm murmuring around the reservoir keeps them on green. And so, we have now assembled almost everything we need. We understand the plumbing, we have the 1980 template, and we can read the depths. There is only one thing left to check, and it is the most convincing piece of all, because it is not a theory or an analogy. It is the fact that we have seen this exact swarm before, under this exact mountain, and we know precisely how the story turned out. Part 9. The 2016 Rehearsal. Here is the fact that should quietly dissolve most of the remaining worry, and almost nobody outside the world of volcano monitoring remembers it. Mount St. Helens did this exact thing 10 years ago, not something similar. This, a swarm of tiny, far below earthquakes, with no swelling and no eruption, that scientists watched carefully, named plainly, and then watched fade. We are not looking at something unprecedented in the summer of 2026. We are looking at a rerun, and we already know how the first showing ended. It happened in the spring of 2016. Beginning around the middle of March that year, the seismographs under the mountain started picking up small earthquakes at a rising rate. Over roughly 8 weeks, the regional network formally located more than 130 of them. And, in a phrase that is going to matter enormously in a moment, the scientists themselves noted that there were many more too small to be located at all. The located count was 130 and change. The true count was higher, and the people running the network said so, out loud, in their public statements. Sit with that for a second, because we are going to need it when we deal with the accusation that agencies hide the numbers. Look at the character of that 2016 swarm, because it is a portrait of the one we are living through now. The earthquakes were tiny. Most of them came in at magnitude 0.5 or smaller, which is far below anything a person could feel, barely a flicker on the instruments. The largest of the entire 8-week sequence reached only about magnitude 1.3, and they were happening between roughly 1 and 4 miles below the surface, down at the level of the reservoir on the recharge floor we talked about, not up near the crater. Small, low, and clustered around the tank. The exact fingerprint. The rate is worth pausing on too, because on its face it sounds alarming, and it turned out not to be. As the weeks went on, the earthquakes did not fade. They increased. By the later stretch of the swarm, the mountain was producing on the order of 40 located earthquakes a week. 40 a week, and climbing. If you knew nothing else, that acceleration might sound like a countdown. And this is where the other instruments earn their keep, because the scientists were not only counting quakes, they were watching everything else at the same time, and everything else was quiet. There was no anomalous gas. The flights that sample the air over the crater for the telltale breath of rising magma found nothing unusual. There was no ground inflation. The instruments that measure the shape of the mountain, the ones that would have caught a swelling surface, showed no swelling. And there was no shallow seismicity, no migration of the earthquakes upward toward the crater. The swarm stayed low. So here was a volcano with earthquakes increasing to 40 a week, and not one of the signals that would accompany a true ascent. No gas, no inflation, no shallowing, just a rising count of small, low pops. And what did the scientists conclude, watching all of that unfold? They called it recharge. They said in plain language that the most likely explanation was magma slowly resupplying the reservoir far below, pressurizing the rock and squeezing out fluids that triggered the little quakes. And they said something else, something I want to quote in spirit because it is the single most calming and clarifying statement in this whole subject. They said that recharge can continue for many years beneath a volcano without leading to an eruption. Not hours, not weeks, years. They even had the receipts from this very mountain. Because Mount St. Helens had done exactly that in living memory, between roughly 1987 and 2004. For something like 17 years, the volcano quietly recharged, stirring and settling, filling its tank without erupting. 17 years of being alive and going nowhere, and then, only at the end of that long stretch, a new episode of dome building began. The lesson written into the mountain's own recent past is that the gap between filling and firing can be measured in decades. Recharge is not a countdown clock. It is closer to a slow heartbeat. It is worth remembering how that 2016 episode was actually handled, because the pattern of it is the pattern we are living again. The observatory did not go silent. It put out an information statement, explained that the most likely cause was recharge of the system far below, and stressed that there was no sign of an imminent eruption. For a few days, headlines flared. The mountain is waking up, some of them said, because a rising count of earthquakes makes a better headline than a careful explanation of reservoir pressure. And then the swarm faded, the count dropped back toward the usual near silence, and the mountain slipped out of the news as quietly as it had entered. Nothing erupted. Nothing was ever going to on that timescale. The story simply ended, the way recharge stories almost always do, with an anticlimax that never gets the same attention as the scare. And 2016 was not even a lone event. Since the last eruption wound down in 2008, Mount St. Helens has muttered like this more than once, producing small clusters of low earthquakes, stirring, settling, and standing down again. Each time, the same reading applies, because each time the fingerprint is the same, small and low and lacking any of the signals of a true ascent. What this tells you is that a swarm under Mount St. Helens is not a rare and ominous departure from normal. On the timescale of the last 2 decades, it is normal. The mountain is not a sleeping thing that has suddenly stirred. It is a stirring thing that we occasionally notice, and the summer of 2026 is one of those noticing moments, not one of those departures. Now lay 2016 over the summer of 2026 and look at how the two line up. Small earthquakes, mostly too faint to feel, located events far below, down at the reservoir, a raw count higher than the official count openly acknowledged, no inflation of the surface, no gas anomaly, no climb toward the crater, every meaningful feature matches. What we are seeing in July of 2026 is not a new and frightening development. It is the same signature the mountain showed 10 years ago, the same signature that resolved into nothing but continued quiet recharge, the same signature the scientists have a name for and a track record with. This is the reassurance at the centre of the whole story, and I want to state it without hedging so it lands. We are not guessing about what a shaking, sinking Mount St. Helens means. We have watched this precise pattern before, under this precise mountain, with far better instruments than we had in 1980, and we have seen where it leads, which is to say, nowhere in a hurry. The morning of July 23rd is not Act 1 of a disaster. It is a rerun of a rerun of a rerun, a mountain doing the ordinary work of being an active volcano between eruptions, and notice how much stronger our position is now than it was in 1980. Back then, the science of reading a volcano in real time was young, the instruments were sparse, and much of what happened had to be pieced together after the fact. Today, This mountain sits inside one of the most capable monitoring systems ever built, with dense networks of seismographs, satellite measurements of its shape, and regular sampling of its gases. So when a swarm like 2016 or the summer of 2026 unfolds, it is not a mystery being guessed at. It is one of the best understood phenomena in all of volcanology, watched in high resolution, checked against a clear precedent, and interpreted with real confidence. The reason the scientists can look at a rising count of earthquakes and still keep the mountain on green is not that they are gambling. It is that they have seen this exact fingerprint before, on this exact mountain, with these exact instruments, and they know what it is. That confidence is earned, and it is the opposite of the blind reassurance people sometimes assume official calm to be. So you would think we could end it there, tie the bow, and go home, and we almost can. Almost. Because there is one number in the summer of 2026 that did not appear in the tidy 2016 story, one detail that keeps nagging even after everything we have established, and it is the very thing we started with. In 2016, the ground was roughly holding its shape. In 2026, the ground is sinking, the surface is deflating, and it has been for years. That is the one piece that does not simply copy over from the reassuring precedent, and if we are going to be honest, we cannot just wave it away. We have to explain it. We have to account for why a recharging mountain, a tank we have argued is quietly filling, would have a surface that is going down instead of holding steady. And the answer to that turns out to be the most illuminating part of the entire story, because it forces us to stop thinking of the mountain as one thing and start seeing it as two. Part 10. The deflation paradox solved. The mistake almost everyone makes with the deflation, myself included the first time I looked at it, is to treat the mountain as a single object. One volcano, one behaviour. If it is filling, the whole thing should be swelling. If it is sinking, the whole thing must be emptying. But a volcano is not one object, and Mount St. Helens least of all. It is a tall system stacked in layers, and the layers can do opposite things at the same time. Once you see it that way, the paradox does not just soften, it disappears entirely. Let me draw the two layers clearly, because the whole solution lives in the difference between them. Far below, miles down, is the reservoir, the tank we have been talking about since the beginning. That is the recharge zone, where fresh magma arrives from the sinking plate and pressurizes the rock. Up high, near the top of the mountain, is the shallow edifice, the crater, and crucially, the new lava dome that was built during the mountain's most recent eruption, the dome-building episode that ran from about 2004 to 2008. Two zones, a lower one that receives magma, and an upper one made largely of the rock the mountain most recently extruded. And after 2008, when that eruption ended, those two zones started doing two different things. The lower reservoir began to repressurize. Once the eruption stopped draining it, the supply from far below kept arriving, and the tank began, slowly, to recover its pressure, to recharge, in exactly the sense we've been describing. Down there, the story is one of quiet refilling, and it has been for years. That is the process the earthquakes belong to. But the upper zone, the shallow dome and the rock around it, began doing the opposite, and for reasons that have nothing to do with the tank draining. Think about what that fresh dome actually was in 2008. It was a pile of newly erupted rock, still hot, freshly solidified, full of gas and full of heat. And a mass like that does not just sit there frozen in time. It cools. It crystallizes further. It releases its trapped gas slowly. It compacts under its own weight. And every one of those shallow processes, cooling, degassing, settling, does the same thing to the surface above it. It makes it contract. It makes it sink. That is the deflation. It is not the reservoir emptying out far below. It is the shallow part of the mountain, the young dome and its surroundings, quietly cooling and compacting and giving up its gas in the years since the last eruption ended. The surface goes down not because the tank is losing magma, but because the lid is slowly settling as it cools. The sinking is a shallow phenomenon. The recharge is a lower one. They are stacked on top of each other, and they are pointing in opposite directions, and both of them are completely normal. This is what I meant, a while ago, when I said the deflation would turn out to be a confirmation rather than a contradiction. Once you separate the two layers, the shaking while sinking signature makes perfect, coherent sense. The earthquakes are the lower reservoir recharging. The subsidence is the upper dome cooling. A single mountain, two floors, two independent processes, and not a hint of conflict between them once you stop insisting the whole thing has to move as one piece. And here is the detail that ties it back to the precedent and closes the loop. Remember that in 2016, during that earlier recharge swarm, the scientists reported no ground inflation. At the time, that might sound like evidence against recharge. If the tank is filling, why isn't the surface rising? But now you have the answer. Recharge far below does not have to lift the surface. The lower reservoir can take on magma and pressure, and the mush around it can absorb much of that change, without the crater floor bulging upward in response. The signal simply does not have to reach the top. So a volcano can recharge far below while its surface stays flat, as in 2016, or even while its surface sinks, as now, because the surface is answering to a different, shallower master. The absence of inflation was never evidence against recharge. It is exactly what quiet recharge looks like from above. This split between the two layers is not a convenient guess I am reaching for to make the numbers behave. It is what the monitoring has actually shown. After the eruption ended in 2008, geodetic measurements detected the magmatic system at depth repressurizing, recovering the pressure it had lost while it was erupting, even as the volcano stayed quiet and unremarkable at the surface. At the same time, the instruments watching the new dome recorded it settling, subsiding, as fresh volcanic rock does when it cools. 2 measurements, 2 depths, 2 directions. The lower repressurization and the shallow subsidence were both observed, and they were observed together. The layered picture is not a theory laid over the data. It is the data. If you want a way to feel the decoupling rather than just accept it, think of the mountain as keeping 2 separate accounts. The lower account, the reservoir, is being credited slowly as magma arrives from below. The upper account, the young dome, is being debited slowly as heat and gas leak out and the rock compacts. The number you can read most easily from the surface, the shape of the mountain, is dominated by that upper account, the debit, so the surface trends downward. But the downward trend at the top tells you almost nothing about the balance far below, which is quietly climbing. Read only the surface and you would think the mountain is losing something. Read both accounts and you see it is losing heat up top while gaining magma down below, which is precisely what a volcano recovering from an eruption does. So the honest bottom line, the one I promised you we would earn rather than assume, is this. The sinking of Mount St. Helens is not the tank draining, it is the lid cooling. And a cooling lid over a slowly filling tank is about the most ordinary state an active volcano between eruptions can be in. The very fact that unsettled you at the start, a mountain going down while it shakes, turns out to be one more line of evidence that what we are watching is maintenance, not countdown. It is worth saying that none of this is unique to Mount St. Helens, which is part of why scientists read it so calmly. Subsidence in the years after an eruption is a well-documented, widely observed thing at volcanoes around the world. When a volcano finishes an eruptive episode, the fresh deposits it has laid down, and the shallow system that fed them, cool and contract and settle over the following years, drawing the surface gently downward. It is one of the more ordinary things a recently active volcano does. So when the instruments show Mount St. Helens slowly subsiding in the long aftermath of its 2004 to 2008 dome building, they are not showing something mysterious or alarming. They are showing textbook post-eruption behavior, the shallow system relaxing, exactly what you would expect from a mountain that finished building a dome less than 2 decades ago and has been resting since. The deflation is not merely compatible with quiet recharge. It is what a healthy, ordinary resting volcano is supposed to look like from above. I would love to end the reassurance right there, cleanly. But being honest about the deflation forces one more uncomfortable admission, and I am not going to skip it, because skipping the uncomfortable parts is how channels lose your trust. If the important action is happening far below at the reservoir, and if the surface can stay flat or even sink while the tank fills, then we are relying almost entirely on faint far below signals to know what this mountain is doing. We are reading a system we cannot see through a handful of tiny earthquakes and instruments precise enough to catch a millimetre of movement. And that raises a fair and pointed question, the one the skeptics have been shouting the whole time. If so much is hidden from view down there, how do we know we're being told the truth about the little we can measure? How do we know the quiet is real and not just the part they are willing to show us? Part 11. The earthquakes they don't report. Let us take the accusation head on because it is everywhere the moment a famous volcano so much as twitches, and because the people making it are not fools. The claim goes like this. The official earthquake count is a lie of omission. For every couple of quakes the authorities announce, dozens more are happening that they do not report. The mountain is far busier than the public is allowed to know, and the calm official bulletins are a deliberate cover, keeping people quiet while something builds. On the morning of July 23rd, when independent watchers looked at the raw traces and counted many more events than the two that got an official magnitude, this is the story a lot of them reach for, and I understand the reflex completely. When you can see wiggles the official number does not mention, it feels like proof that you are being managed. So let me do the thing this channel always tries to do. Let me grant the true part first, fully and without flinching, and then show you why the conclusion drawn from it is wrong. Because the true part is genuinely true. There really are more events on the raw seismic traces than appear in the official located catalogue. That is not a rumour. It is a fact, and it is a fact the scientists themselves state plainly. On the morning in question, the number of little flickers on the unfiltered records was higher than the count of formerly located earthquakes. The gap the skeptics point to is real. It is the meaning they assign to it that falls apart. We already saw, when we talked about how depth is measured, why most of those flickers never become catalogued earthquakes. To formally locate a quake and give it a magnitude and a spot, you need the same signal recorded cleanly at several stations, so you can triangulate. The smallest events register on only one instrument, or two, and there is simply not enough information to solve for where they were. They are not being suppressed. They are physically unlocatable with the data they left behind. A whisper heard by one microphone cannot be placed in a room. That is not secrecy. That is geometry. But here is the part that should end the conspiracy version entirely, and it is the detail I asked you to hold on to earlier. The scientists announce the uncounted events. They do not hide them. Go back to 2016. When the network reported that Swarm, they said, in their own public statements, that they had located more than 130 earthquakes, and that there were many more too small to be located. They volunteered the existence of the events that never made the catalogue. Think about how strange that would be for a cover-up. A cover-up does not issue a press release reminding you that the true number is higher than the number it just gave you. The very transparency the skeptics say is missing is right there in the record, in black and white, from the agencies themselves. The misunderstanding, at its root, is about what the catalogue is for. People treat the official earthquake list as if it were meant to be a complete census of every tremor, so that any event missing from it must have been deliberately erased. But that is not what the catalogue is. The catalogue is a floor, not a ceiling. It is the set of events solid enough to be pinned down with confidence, and it is understood by everyone who uses it to be a lower bound, not a total. The raw trace is the fuller, messier picture, freely available, and the located catalogue is the carefully verified subset drawn from it. Neither one is hidden. They are two different tools, and mistaking the verified subset for a claim of totality is where the whole suspicion is born. There is also a practical reason the catalogue holds itself to that standard, and it protects you rather than deceives you. Remember everything that shakes a seismograph on a mountain: wind in the trees, rockfall in the crater, ice cracking on the glacier, a logging truck, a river, a storm far offshore. If the networks threw every raw wiggle into the official earthquake catalogue without verifying it, across multiple stations, that catalogue would be polluted with events that were never earthquakes at all. The threshold is not there to hide real quakes, it is there to keep imaginary ones out. A catalogue that counted everything would be worse than useless. It would be actively misleading, and it would hand you false alarms dressed up as data. There is one more fact that ought to close the case, and it is almost funny once you notice it. The raw data is public. The very seismogram traces that the independent watchers used to arrive at their higher counts are the official, live feeds from the monitoring stations, streamed out for anyone to see. That is how those watchers counted the extra events in the first place. They did not sneak into a vault. They looked at the same public records the agencies publish in real time. So the picture the conspiracy version paints of scientists hiding earthquakes the public is not allowed to know about collapses on contact with reality, because the earthquakes in question are being broadcast to the world on official instruments as they happen. You cannot simultaneously hide a signal and live stream it. The uncounted events are not secret. They are just uncounted in the specific honest sense that they were too faint to formally locate, and the traces that show them are open to anyone with the curiosity to look. Understand what that means for the accusation. The same institution supposedly suppressing the data is the one giving you the data. Live for free, including the faint events it openly declines to put a number on. That is the opposite of a cover-up. A cover-up controls what you can see. This system hands you everything it sees, raw, and then tells you honestly which parts of it are solid enough to build on and which are not. What looks, at a glance, like two numbers that do not match, the small official count and the larger raw count, is really a window into how carefully these people refuse to claim more than they can prove. I want to name what is really underneath this suspicion, because I think it is worth taking seriously rather than mocking. The fear is not fundamentally about earthquakes. It is about being lied to. It is the worry that the people with the instruments know something you do not, and are choosing not to tell you, that the calm is a performance. That is a human fear, and in a world where institutions have sometimes earned that distrust, it is not crazy to feel it. But the cure for it here is not to reject the data. It is to understand the instrument well enough that the gap between the raw trace and the catalogue stops looking like a lie and starts looking like what it is, which is careful science refusing to overstate what it knows. And when you make that shift, something clarifying happens. You stop worrying about the earthquakes that are supposedly hidden, and you start realizing that the real danger was never hidden data at all. The real danger, the thing that actually trips people up again and again with this mountain, is the opposite. It is misreading the events that are in plain sight, that everyone can see, that no one is hiding. Because Mount St. Helens has a long habit of showing the whole world a dramatic-looking signal, right out in the open, that turns out to mean nothing, and of doing it convincingly enough that people brace for an eruption that never comes. The mountain does not need to hide anything to fool you. It has fooled people twice in recent years while sitting in full view, and understanding how it did that is the last thing we need before we can answer the only question that really matters. Part 12. The False Alarms. If the danger is not hidden earthquakes, then what is it? The honest answer is that the real hazard, the one that actually catches people out with this mountain, is the false alarm. It is the signal that looks like an eruption is coming and turns out to mean nothing, and Mount St. Helens is remarkably good at producing them. Twice in just the last couple of years, it has staged a convincing scare in full public view, and looking at how it did that is the best possible preparation for reading the real thing when it finally comes. Start with the earthquakes, because the mountain gave everyone a genuine fright with those not long ago. In 2023 and again in 2024, Mount St. Helens produced a run of elevated seismicity that stood out sharply from its usual quiet. In fact, it was the largest short-term jump in earthquake rates the mountain had shown since its last eruption ended back in 2008. Read that sentence the way an anxious person would. The most earthquakes in 15 years. If ever there were a line to launch 1,000 alarming videos, that was it. And yet the scientists watching did not raise the alert level, and they were right not to. Because when they checked the swarm against everything we have talked about, it passed every test for the harmless kind. The earthquakes were small. They sat far below, down at the recharge floor. There was no inflation, no gas anomaly, no climb toward the crater. It was the 2016 fingerprint again, just a little busier. The largest short-term increase in 15 years, and still, unmistakably, recharge. Nothing erupted. The rates eased back toward background, and the mountain went quiet again, exactly as the read predicted. The scary headline number, the most since 2008, meant almost nothing once you knew which floor the quakes were on. Then came the stranger of the two false alarms, and this one did not even involve fresh magma at all. On September 16th, 2025, plumes were seen rising above the peak of Mount St. Helens, grey columns lifting off the summit, exactly the kind of sight that makes a person's blood run cold. Photos spread. The obvious interpretation was the terrifying one. The mountain is erupting, and the situation was alarming enough that the United States Geological Survey had to step in publicly and tell people, in plain words, that Mount St. Helens was not erupting. So what were the plumes? They were ash, but not new ash, not fresh volcanic material from below. They were 45-year-old ash, left over from the 1980 eruption, sitting on the flanks of the mountain, lifted into the air by nothing more sinister than strong wind. The mountain had thrown up a ghost of its last eruption, a cloud of decades-old dust, and for a few hours it wore the costume of a new one convincingly enough to require an official denial. Think about how perfectly that captures the whole problem. A completely non-volcanic event, wind-moving old dust, looked exactly like the thing everyone fears, because we are primed to see this mountain erupting, and our eyes fill in the rest. These two episodes point at a real and underappreciated danger, and it cuts in both directions. On one side, if every recharge swarm and every dust plume gets treated as an imminent eruption, people burn out. They hear the alarm so many times that when a real one comes, they have already learned to roll their eyes, cry wolf often enough, and the village stops running. On the other side, the scientists cannot simply wave everything away either, because the one time they dismiss something that turns out to be real would be catastrophic and unforgivable. They have to hold a difficult line, taking every signal seriously enough to check it thoroughly, while refusing to sound an alarm the data does not justify. That balance is the entire discipline of watching a volcano, and it is quietly heroic when it works. Look a little closer at how those 2023 and 2024 swarms were handled, because it is a small masterclass in not panicking. As the earthquake rates climbed, the observatory did exactly what it had done in 2016. It acknowledged the increase openly, described it plainly as the most notable in years, and then explained patiently that everything else remained consistent with background, with ordinary recharge, and that the alert level was staying at normal. They did not bury the numbers, and they did not inflate them. They put them in context, which is the least dramatic and most useful thing a monitoring agency can do. And the mountain proved them right by doing nothing. Again. There is a reason the waking up story keeps coming back anyway, no matter how many times it fails to pan out, and it has less to do with the mountain than with us. A rising earthquake count is easy to turn into a headline. Reservoir pressure and background rates are not. Fear travels faster and further than context, so every genuine, harmless swarm gets a fresh coat of alarm painted over it by someone who either does not understand the depth of the quakes or would rather not let it get in the way of a good scare. Understanding the difference is a kind of inoculation. Once you know that a low swarm without inflation is recharge, the frightening headlines lose their grip because you can see straight through them to the ordinary data underneath. None of this means the scientists get to be cavalier, and they know that better than anyone. The reason they investigate every swarm and every plume so thoroughly, even the ones they strongly suspect are harmless, is that the cost of being wrong in the other direction is unthinkable. 57 people died the last time this mountain erupted. So the calm you hear in an official statement is not laziness, and it is not complacency. It is the output of people who have checked, carefully, and found nothing alarming, and who carry the memory of 1980 with them every time they decide whether to raise the alarm. Their restraint is earned, not casual. It helps to know what a genuinely rising volcano looks like, for contrast, so the eye is not fooled. We looked recently at a caldera near Naples in Italy that has been slowly, measurably lifting for years, its ground rising, its shape inflating in a way instruments can track and map. That is what real, sustained inflation looks like, and it is worth seeing precisely because Mount St. Helens is not doing it. Held next to a volcano whose surface is genuinely rising, the summer of 2026 at St. Helens reads even more clearly as its opposite, a surface that is settling, not swelling. The contrast is the lesson. Once you have seen what a mountain truly loading up looks like, the false alarms lose their power to frighten you. There is a genuine reason for cautious optimism buried in the mountain's own chemistry, and it is worth ending this stretch on. Some volcanoes, the ones with runnier, gas-poor magma, can shift from quiet to erupting with unsettling speed and little fanfare. Mount St. Helens is not really one of those. Its magma is stickier and more charged with gas, the kind that has to fight its way upward, and tends to make a great deal of noise on the way, in earthquakes, in deformation, in gas and steam, before it finally breaks the surface. That is not a guarantee of a long warning. But it does mean this particular mountain has a history of announcing itself, loudly and for weeks, exactly as it did across the spring of 1980. The style of volcano that St. Helens is tends to telegraph its intentions rather than hide them, so the picture that emerges is not one of a mountain waiting to ambush us. It is one of a mountain that, when it truly moves toward an eruption, is likely to make itself heard well in advance, on instruments watching every level of its plumbing, read by people who hold the 1980 template and the 2016 precedent both in hand. That does not make it safe. Nothing about a mountain like this is ever fully safe, but it does mean the honest odds favour warning over surprise and understanding over panic. Which brings us, at last, to the only question that has ever really mattered in this entire story. We have cleared away the myths. It is not hidden earthquakes. It is not a secret eruption behind a dust cloud. It is not a countdown wearing the costume of recharge. All of that is noise, so strip it away and ask the one thing worth asking. When the real countdown does come, and someday it will, because this is the most active volcano in the Cascade Range and its clock is still running, what will it actually look like, and would we recognise it in time or dismiss it as one more false alarm? Part 13. What the real countdown will look like. Here is the strange gift buried in everything we have covered. Because we understand what recharge looks like, and because we have the 1980 template memorised, we can write out, in advance, the checklist for a real countdown, not vaguely, specifically. 5 signals, each one the mirror image of something we have already established as calm today. If Mount St. Helens ever truly begins to move toward an eruption, these are the boxes that will start getting checked, and knowing them is the difference between panic and preparation. The first signal would be the earthquake's changing address. Everything we have said about today rests on the quakes being far below, down at the reservoir on the recharge floor. A real ascent would announce itself by the earthquake's climbing, migrating upward over days and weeks from the reservoir toward the shallow body of the mountain, toward the crater. That upward march is the single clearest sign that magma is no longer just filling the tank, but is on the move toward the surface. Today the quakes are low and staying low. The day they start walking upward is the day the first box gets checked. The second signal would be a change in the sound itself. Right now the mountain is producing discrete pops, the sharp, separate jolts of rock adjusting to pressure. A countdown would bring harmonic tremor, that continuous rhythmic hum we heard in the 1980 story, the signature of fluid or magma actually flowing through the system, rather than rock simply cracking. When the sharp, separate knocks give way to a sustained hum, the character of the unrest has fundamentally changed. Today it is knocks. The day it becomes a hum is the second box. The third signal is the one we have leaned on most, and it would be the most visible. Today the surface is sinking, deflating, the shallow lid cooling above the filling tank. A real countdown would reverse that. The ground would stop settling and start rising, inflating, as magma pushed up into the shallow mountain and forced the surface outward, the way the north flank swelled 5 feet a day in 1980. The instruments that measure the shape of the mountain to the millimetre would stop recording a slow exhale and start recording an inhale. The day the deflation turns to inflation is the third and perhaps most important box, because it means the magma has finally reached the shallow levels where eruptions are staged. The fourth signal would be the mountain's breath. We said that a quiet recharge keeps its gas locked far below, and that the flights sampling the air over the crater find nothing unusual. A countdown would change that. As magma rose toward the surface, the pressure holding its gas dissolved would drop, and the gas would come out, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide climbing in the measurements, the volcano beginning to exhale the chemistry of magma near the surface. Rising gas is one of the earliest and most reliable tells that magma is genuinely ascending. Today the readings are quiet. The day they start to climb is the fourth box. The fifth signal would be the opening move of 1980 itself, the Freatic blast. As heat finally reached the shallow water hiding in the mountain, that water would flash to steam and detonate, punching small craters, throwing old rock and ash, exactly as it did in March of that year before the main event. A steam blast is the mountain clearing its throat, the sign that fresh heat has arrived at shallow levels. There has been nothing like it in the summer of 2026. The day a steam explosion tears open a patch of the crater is the fifth box, and by then no one would need convincing. And here is the reassuring part about that whole list. We would very likely see it coming, because the net watching for these signals is extraordinary. This is the most closely monitored volcano in the country. There are seismographs listening for the quakes to climb, and for the pops to become a hum. There are satellite and ground instruments measuring the shape of the mountain to a fraction of an inch, ready to catch the moment deflation turns to inflation. There are aircraft that sample the crater's air for rising gas. There are radar satellites passing overhead again and again, all of it feeding an observatory built in the most literal sense from the lessons of the last eruption. If the boxes start getting checked, People whose entire careers are devoted to this mountain will see them getting checked. One thing worth stressing about that checklist is that no single box on its own means an eruption is imminent. A brief flurry of slightly shallower quakes, a single wisp of gas, a day of tremor, any one of these can happen and then fade back to nothing. The mountain generates ambiguous flickers all the time. What actually matters is convergence, several of these signals arriving together and building in the same direction over days and weeks, the way they did in 1980, when the shallow quakes and the steam and the tremor and the bulge all stacked up at once and pointed at a single conclusion. A real countdown is not one alarm. It is a chorus of them, reinforcing one another. That is both harder to fake and harder to miss than any single reading, and it is what the scientists are really watching for. Not any one needle, but the pattern of all of them beginning to move together. There are other, subtler signs that would fill in around those 5 too if the mountain were truly loading up. The floor of the crater and the existing dome might begin to deform, to crack and shift as pressure built beneath them. The vents that already breathe faint heat and gas might grow hotter and more vigorous. New fractures might open, small rockfalls inside the crater might increase, the temperature of the ground and the water might climb. None of these alone would be conclusive, but layered in with the main 5 they would thicken the case. And the reason to mention them is not to hand you more things to fear, but to show how many independent windows there are into this mountain. It would have to fool all of them at once, silently, to catch everyone off guard, and a volcano moving enough magma to erupt is a very loud thing to try to do in secret. All of this is why the quiet years matter as much as the loud ones. Every day the mountain spends on green, with its instruments recording the ordinary rhythm of recharge, is another entry in the long record of what normal looks like here. That record is exactly what makes an abnormality detectable. You cannot recognize the surface starting to rise unless you have measured precisely for years how it behaves when it is merely settling. The patient, unglamorous monitoring of a mountain doing almost nothing is not wasted effort. It is the very thing that will let someone notice, early, the day the pattern finally breaks. I have to be honest about the limits though, because certainty is not something volcanoes offer. A warning is likely, but it is not guaranteed, and it might not be long. Volcanoes do not sign contracts. Sometimes the run-up is slow and legible, 2 full months of escalation as in 1980. Sometimes it could be faster, the boxes checking in days rather than weeks, the lead time short and the decisions urgent. And sometimes the signals can be ambiguous, a swarm that looks like it might be climbing and then stalls, a flicker of gas that fades. Reading a volcano in real time is not the same as knowing its schedule. The scientists in 1980 could measure a 450-foot bulge and still not name the hour it would fail. Humility is part of the honest picture. But hold the checklist up against the mountain as it actually sits in the summer of 2026 box by box and feel the result. The earthquakes are not climbing. The pops have not become a hum. The surface is not inflating, it is sinking. The gas is not rising. There has been no steam blast, 5 signals that would mark a real countdown, and not one of them is present. That is, genuinely, the most reassuring sentence in this entire story. And it is also, if you think about it for a moment longer, the most fragile, because every one of those calm readings is a thing that can change, and the whole quiet rests on their staying where they are. Part 14. The mountain is moving again. So let us go back to the phrase we started with. The 2 small words that make this mountain's every twitch feel like a threat. It's moving again. That is the fear, whispered every time the seismographs jump, and after everything we have walked through, I want to hand that phrase back to you turned around, because it is true, and it is not what you thought it meant. Yes, Mount St. Helens is moving again. It is moving the way a living volcano between eruptions moves. It is moving because it is being fed, because the tank far below is filling, because the machine offshore never stopped delivering magma to it. Moving here does not mean erupting. Moving means alive. Pull the whole picture together one last time and see how quietly it all fits. On a July morning, the ground under the mountain shook, faintly, a couple of dozen times. The official count was small, the raw count larger, and both were honest. The earthquake sat far below, down at the reservoir, not up near the crater. The surface of the mountain, meanwhile, was not swelling to meet them. It was settling, cooling, sinking as it has for years, shaking and sinking at the same time, and that combination, which felt like a contradiction at the start, we now know to read fluently. It is the signature of a reservoir recharging far below while the young rock above it cools and compacts. It is filling, not firing. We have seen it before in 2016 and read it right. We are seeing it again and reading it the same way. The long view is the part that should finally settle your pulse. When Mount St. Helens last erupted, the dome-building episode that ran from about 2004 to 2008, it had spent something like 17 years quietly recharging beforehand, stirring and settling and going nowhere, from the late 1980s until the early 2000s. 17 years of being alive without erupting. That is the tempo of this thing. Recharge is not a fuse burning down toward a set time. It is a slow, patient refilling that can run for years or decades, punctuated by little swarms like the one we are living through, each of which feels urgent in the moment and resolves, almost always, into more quiet. There is something almost humbling in that, if you let yourself feel it. We are watching a mountain breathe on a timescale that has nothing to do with us. Its inhale takes decades. Its exhale, when it finally comes, will take minutes, and we will remember it for a century. In between, it does exactly what it is doing now, drawing magma slowly upward from a sinking plate, filling a chamber miles below the surface, shrugging occasionally in a scatter of tiny earthquakes that we notice for a day and then forget. The mountain keeps a clock our attention spans were never built to read, and most of what it does happens in the long, quiet stretches we're not paying attention to. But I am not going to end on false comfort, because the whole reason this channel exists is to sit honestly in the space between panic and dismissal, and honesty requires one more turn. All of that reassurance rests on a set of readings that are true today and are not promised tomorrow. The mountain has stood down again and again, in 2016, in 2023, in 2024, every time returning to quiet. It will almost certainly stand down from this swarm too, almost certainly. But this is the most active volcano in the Cascade Range, sitting over a plate that never stops sinking, fed by a machine that never stops running, and the one iron law of Mount St. Helens is that it does not stay quiet forever. It has stood down every single time, until the one time it will not. That day is not today. It is not this swarm. But it is coming, on the mountain's clock, not ours. Consider what moving again has actually meant physically over the mountain's life since 1980. When the eruption tore away the summit and blew out the north flank, it did not end the mountain's story. It started a new chapter of construction. In the years right after, from 1980 into the mid-1980s, lava pushed up into the fresh crater and built a dome, a mound of solidified rock slowly stacking where the old summit used to be. Then the mountain rested, and then, from 2004 to 2008, it did it again, extruding a whole series of stiff spines and adding a new dome to the crater floor. Twice now, in the span of a single human generation, Mount St. Helens has been quietly rebuilding itself from the inside, replacing by slow accumulation what it destroyed in a morning. That is what moving looks like most of the time on this mountain. Not destruction, construction. A volcano patiently putting itself back together. The recharge we're watching in the summer of 2026 is the phase between those building episodes, the long quiet refilling that comes after a dome is finished and before the next one begins. The mountain built, then rested and recharged for about 17 years, then built again, and then, since 2008, has been resting and recharging once more. The swarm on July 23rd is a sound from inside that resting phase, the tank topping up in the dark, the same phase that has produced nothing but quiet for going on 2 decades. Placed in that rhythm, the morning that started this whole story stops looking like the opening of a disaster and starts looking like exactly what it is. A small, ordinary noise in the middle of a long, ordinary pause. It is worth remembering that people live in the shadow of this mountain right now and have the entire time it has been recharging. They hike its trails, they run their towns in the valleys below, they raise families within sight of the crater, and they do all of it atop a volcano that is, by every honest measure, active and refilling. That is not recklessness. It is what it means to live near a Cascade volcano, and the thing that makes it livable is precisely the kind of understanding we've been building. The ability to tell a recharge swarm from a countdown, a dust plume from an eruption, a settling lid from a rising one. Fear treats every tremor as the end. Knowledge lets you live your life on the mountain slope while still respecting what it can do. The goal was never to stop worrying entirely. It was to worry about the right thing, at the right time, for the right reason. There is a temptation, when a mountain like this goes quiet again, to simply forget it until the next scare. I would gently push against that, because the most interesting truth here is not the reassurance, it is the scale. Beneath our feet, on a clock we can barely perceive, an ocean plate is sinking, wringing out its water, melting the rock above it, and sending magma on a journey of miles and years up into a chamber under a mountain in Washington, which stores it and settles and shrugs and waits. All of that is happening right now, slowly, whether we watch it or not. The morning of July 23rd was one of the rare moments the process made a sound loud enough for us to hear. Most of the time it moves in a silence we mistake for sleep. So when someone shows you those two little words, "It's moving again," and expects your stomach to drop, you now have something better than fear to answer with. You can say, "Yes, it is moving," and here is what that means. It means the tank is filling, far below, the way it has been for years. It means the quakes are low and small and staying where recharge lives. It means the surface is cooling and settling, not swelling. It means every box on the real countdown checklist is still empty. Moving is not the warning. Moving is the mountain being what it is, an active volcano between eruptions, doing in the dark the patient work it has always done. So what do we actually watch for now that we can read the mountain instead of just fearing it? Not the raw earthquake count, which will rise and fall and tell us little on its own. Not a dust plume, which the wind can fake. We watch the one number that separates every calm morning from the beginning of the end, the shape of the mountain itself. Today, it is sinking. Today, the lid is cooling over a tank that is quietly filling. And the question that this whole story finally comes down to, the one worth carrying with you long after the seismographs go quiet again, is simply this. What happens on the day the sinking stops, and the surface of Mount St. Helens for the first time in years begins instead to rise?